Well, hello there, and I do hope you're all well. Well, after the accusations from Raphael Marshall, a former desk officer at the Foreign Office, that Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab misled Parliament over evacuations of Afghans from Kabul because of chaos and dysfunction at the Foreign Office, James O'Brien on LBC invited the former deputy head of the Provisional Restructuring Team in Helmand Province in Afghanistan onto his show to tell his audience his expert opinion about what was being going on after he wrote a Twitter thread. To say his opinion was very damning was quite an understatement.
Before that, I want to introduce you to Arthur Snell, who is currently the Managing Director of Orbis Business Intelligence, but was previously the former if it was previously, Deputy Head of the Provincial Restructuring Team in Helmand Province in Afghanistan. And I wanted to talk to Arthur today because of this whistleblowing story, and also because of a thread he wrote on Twitter with some interesting speculation. If you're not across the story, the accusation from a former desk officer at the Foreign Office is that Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab misled Parliament over the evacuation of Afghans from Kabul because of chaos and dysfunction at the Foreign Office. He described a chaotic system that failed to prioritise for evacuation those to whom Britain owed the most responsibility, adding that less than 5% had received any help and that it is clear that some of those left behind have since been murdered by the Taliban. Arthur, even as I say those words, I reel a bit, because the stakes could be no higher, and yet the story, well, one worries a little bit that it won't achieve, A, the attention that it deserves, and more importantly, the consequences.
Yes, indeed. It's one of those things that everybody was focused on at the time. We all remember those pictures, really disturbing pictures around the airport in Kabul in August. And then, of course, we all move on. And one of the reasons that we moved on, I think, is because the government announced that it had this scheme in place that over the next few years would bring 20,000 Afghans here, for particularly some of those who weren't able to get to the airport in August. But, of course, that doesn't seem to be happening.
So, I mean, you're suggesting, I think, that the scheme was a sort of an exercise in smoke and mirrors, then, to assuage public concern while not necessarily delivering anything that it was ostensibly designed to deliver.
I think that's exactly what's happening. The scheme was announced on the 18th of August. I appreciate, it's very easy for people outside government, of course, I've been on the inside, to say, well, how difficult can it be? But I don't seriously think that now in mid-December, we could still be in a situation where there's no information on that scheme. And as Raphael Marshall, the Foreign Office whistleblower, has identified, people who had the right, who had a connection to the UK, have since been murdered. And I know from personal connections that I have, I'm still in touch with people in Afghanistan, that they've given up on the UK. There are people who are being accepted by other countries, by Ireland, by Portugal, by Costa Rica, countries that have no particular connectivity with the Afghan situation, and yet on a humanitarian basis they're doing the right thing, and yet the so-called Afghan citizen resettlement scheme is still not open.
I mean, you're talking about people to whom the United Kingdom has a debt of honour, I think.
Yeah.
Who you feel have been completely abandoned.
Yes, and we've all heard about interpreters. There are other people. There are people who worked as security guards, people who worked even, maybe simple jobs like cleaning or catering, any type of job which put you in direct contact with foreign forces, with what the Taliban would regard as NATO enemy occupying forces, of course, puts you at significant risk. And then, of course, there's a wider group, the people who were sponsored by British government funds to do things like women's rights programs, outreach, education, and so on. All of these things are regarded with great suspicion and hostility by the Taliban, and in some cases are targeted for retribution.
And do you have is there any more charitable reading of why it would still not yet be open? I notice you point us towards the fact that it was last updated, the webpage, in September. It's now. Well, I mean, this isn't a scoop, but it's now the end of the first week in December. Is there a more charitable reading of why that wouldn't have happened by now?
Well, let's try our hardest. Yes. Maybe, you could argue, as we know, the government is trying to bring in a new nationality and borders bill. Of course, this is the bill that would criminalise the people who seek to come here without a visa or other formal immigration status. So maybe they're saying we need to get that bill in place first. But let's just think about that. What you're saying is, no, you need to sit there in Afghanistan, try not to get murdered. And if you do try to escape Afghanistan and come to Britain, we'll treat you as a criminal.
We should stress as well that Raphael Marshall was speaking to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I think the word whistleblower can sometimes be a little bit misleading. It makes it sound as if that he's... this is actually part of the mechanics of government, isn't it? This is part of the checks and scrutiny on our democracy. And I wonder how persuasive you find his testimony.
It's very persuasive. If people have time, they should try to locate his actual document. It's written in an extremely sober manner. It's the sort of document you'd expect from a former Foreign Office desk officer. It is not alarmist. It doesn't make bold claims. It is very clear, strongly evident. And I think it's very clear that there was a completely chaotic and underwhelming situation in that emergency response. And I think the key point there is one of leadership. I've worked, as is obvious, in the Foreign Office. At the end of the day, if something needs to happen, if it's to do with staffing a 24/7 operation, a crisis thing, the leadership comes from the top. Well, where was the leadership? One of them was on a beach in Crete, and the other was pretend that nothing was happening.
And yet the claim that the evacuation was a great success has been allowed to fly.
Yeah, and of course, like all these things, this is not to take away from those people who were in Kabul doing their utmost, our soldiers, our diplomats, other people risking their lives. We remember the hideous bombing that killed well over 100 people. So I'm not questioning the commitment and resolve of those people, but they were sent effectively into a battle without the weapons. They didn't have IT that worked. They didn't have phones that worked at the beginning. Their capability to manage the evacuation was extremely limited. And then you add to that the crazy political decisions, such as the one to bring out the animal charity workers. There's no evidence whatsoever that workers for an animal charity would be targeted by the Taliban, and yet they were prioritized over other cases.
Final question. Does this lead anywhere? Do you see this prompting any meaningful change, perhaps even just the opening of the scheme, the ACRS scheme?
Well, I would really like to see that happen. It seems to me that we mustn't forget these people. A lot of people, such as myself, who worked in Afghanistan, are still in contact with huge networks of people in that country who are trying to get out, who are trying to reach a place of safety. The government can't just pretend this is over. We've got to make it possible and straightforward for people who have a reasonable fear of persecution to come to a place of safety.
Arthur Snell, many thanks. Arthur, as I mentioned, is a former deputy head of the provincial restructuring team in Helmand province and now works as managing director of Orbis Business Intelligence. It's odd, isn't it, how you can whip up that sort of patriotic fervour quite easily in some sometimes cynical circumstances. But this kind of thing, I'm not suggesting it gets a free pass, but the idea that people to whom we owe a debt of honour have been abandoned in Afghanistan, and the suggestion that the current Home Secretary might quite like it that way, because of course it keeps people from the sort of countries that refugees are fleeing in well-documented circumstances out of the United Kingdom, and the calculation is that is electorally popular. What have we become, honestly?
Indeed, what have we become? These brave people who, through taking great personal risk, helped our brave soldiers out there, were left abandoned by this band of brigands who had already proved last Christmas that they think they're above the law by having a proper knees up, while everybody else was in a lockdown. And to make matters worse, after these self-entitled bandits had abandoned those who they owe a debt of honour to, they also decided that if you do manage to not get yourself murdered by the Taliban for helping our troops after we dropped you in it, you dare try to make your way here, you will not only have to face the wrath of a lying racist charlatan, filming you floating in the sea to use you to scare his racist fans on his GBB's programme. You will also be treated like a criminal and be treated like the lowest of the low. Do you know what? I always try to, add a little humour to what I do on this channel. Because if you don't laugh, you'll cry. But if I'm honest, I find it really hard not to be embarrassed to be English at the moment. I try not to, but I find it more and more difficult. I always try and live by this quote by Dr. Martin Niemöller. He once said, "First they came for the socialists. I did not speak out because I'm not a sports socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I did not speak out because I'm not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak for me." Now, with those out there saying, when they watch this video, they're saying, "DB, I think you're talking out your backside. They would never do that to us." Well, the late great Tony Benn once said, "The way government treats refugees is very instructive because it shows you how they would treat the rest of us if they thought they could get away with it." So this band of brigands can abandon people who they owe a debt of honour, so to speak. Don't you think this lot won't do the exact same thing to you? And judging by the way they've handled the pandemic over the last year or so, people might actually easily say they've already done that. And there's still those out there still saying, "Leave him alone, he's doing his best." Yeah, what have we become indeed? Right, I shall leave the video here, and until the next time, I shall bid you farewell. Take care.